So let's start.
Let's start.
Okay. So in 2017, you started working on an Arab revisionist history of the June 1967 Arab-Israeli War, later expanding its scope to encompass the War of Attrition and the 1973 October War. I hope I'm not mistaken. Um, so what prompted you to write this revisionist history, and how does it depart from the existing literature on this period?
What prompted me to write this is that I do not really think that we have a good critical history of the defeat. I believe that this is an open wound that has been festering. It's a decisive moment, obviously, in modern Arab and modern Egyptian history. But I don't think Egyptian society and the larger Arab societies have managed to deal with this wound. Obviously, it is a defeat. It's a catastrophic defeat, which brings across feelings of trauma and helplessness. But um, but in terms of academic scholarship, I don't think we in Egypt have produced scholarship that in terms of size and in terms of sophistication that is commensurate with the scale of this war. And the literature, the academic literature on the war is very thin. Our understanding of the war is mostly drawn from books and memoirs and articles that are not written by academic historians. They're written by the participants themselves or by journalists or by cultural commentators and critics. And they're all very valuable, and I'm making use of this. But in terms of the actual professional academic engagement with 67, for reasons that we will probably touch upon that have to do with lack of sources, but there were other reasons as well. We have very little. So when you ask me about revisionist historiography, I actually have to say that it's not that there is a standard Egyptian narrative, academic, consistent academic narrative, or even a non-academic narrative. I don't think it exists. So part of what I'm trying to do is to try and find out what our understanding of what the popular understanding of 67 is, what people mean when they say certain things. I'll give you an example. Very often, you read and hear in the artistic production on 67, in movies, the following, and also in academic literature, the following phrase, that the army was a victim of the defeat. And that's an interesting way of putting it, So I needed to understand what is meant by this. It's never elaborated upon, it's never really fleshed out, but it's a statement that is made often. And my question is, how can an army that is supposedly responsible, I mean, the army is what fights, and this is a war in which the army was defeated. So, and then when you dig a bit deeper, I mean, the initial understanding of this statement is that there's an international conspiracy of sorts, and that Egypt was lured in, and Nasser was in particular lured in and fell into a trap. But it actually is more complex than that. What people mean is not just an international conspiracy, but that domestically there was something that allowed the army to be drawn into it, and it was blamed um, unjustly for the defeat. So that, raises the question, what is meant by this, and who dragged the army into this, and what is meant by this? So the second part of your question, so basically I'm offering a revisionist account, yes, but I'm actually also trying to construct as consistently as I can the narrative that I want to deconstruct, the standard narrative, because it's not out there. It's not formulated, it's not crystallized clearly, which is, again, in a sense, if you want to zoom out, kind of, it's a sign of our defeat that we cannot even have a grasp over what happened, cannot have a consistent set of claims or even questions about which we disagree. So I'm trying to identify these questions, and I'm then trying to offer an alternative revisionist account. So that takes me to the second part of your question, which is what is it that I'm doing differently? Well, for one thing, I'm trying to make the most of the published memoirs of the participants, the generals. There are a number of them who have published memoirs starting from the late 1970s, 10 years after the war or so. Some have given interviews, some had been imprisoned, and then were released in 74, 75, and then they gave these press interviews. And they've never been consistently read together. So the people who assume and make the argument that the army was a victim, they've never really been heard. So one of the things I'm trying to do is to read as many of the published memoirs and testimonials as possible. But methodologically, I think what I am doing differently is to combine an analysis of military affairs and military developments with an analysis of the political, but also the cultural aspect. So what do I mean by this? I mean that very often, if you read the standard account, for example, is Haeckel, and in a sense, what I am actually refuting is Haeckel's account. Haeckel, has a very formidable narrative, and it starts from 56 and it goes to even beyond 73. And 67 is one big volume in the middle of what he calls the 30-Year War. It's a book of more than 1,000 pages, and the book is full of important, of course, first-hand information that you cannot find elsewhere of grand politics and geostrategic. I mean, that's his prism is a geostrategic prism. I mean, in a sense, I consider Haeckel to be Nasser's national security advisor. Of course, Nasser and Sadat later had national security advisors, but he is, I mean, he's not just Nasser's speechwriter or confidant or editor-in-chief of Al-Ahram or mouthpiece. No, he is a decision maker. He's a policy maker, and he's also a very good writer. So a result of this is that he's the Kissinger of Egypt. In my reading. So he offers this grand narrative. He takes us from Moscow to Tel Aviv to Washington to Paris to London, and of course Cairo and Nasser, and big questions. And paradoxically, when it comes to 67 or 73 or 57 or 56, the war, the military, the combat, the experience, the people on the ground doing fighting, are missing. There's no analysis of military details whatsoever. And so what I'm trying to do is to uh, pay attention to the military details, the units, the names of commanders, the performance of various regiments, the performance of various forces, where the troops were, to explain how an army of about 80,000 men disappeared. Not in 6 days, in a day and a half, or maybe maximum 2 days. By the end of the 6th of June, the Egyptian army is no longer. So that just militarily, in terms of old-fashioned military history, needs an explanation. How can you account for this? Not how can you describe it before you can explain it? Just describe how the army disintegrated. We don't have an account of this. We have an account of people fleeing. Many in popular imagination, in movies, in songs, and in historical reckoning and writing. There is a description of the troops, of the men barefoot, making it to the canal and then across the canal. But the 36 to 48 hours before that, when did men leave the units? And I think this is important to identify this moment, not in Cairo, but in Sinai, to try and explain it, and then zoom out bit by bit, layer by layer, until you reach the high command, the central command in Cairo, and above that, Egypt. And then we make the link with Moscow. We make the link with Washington. But I have to start from below. So what I think I'm doing differently is to combine military history, very old-fashioned military history, not even the experience of the soldier. No, the history of the units and the mobility of units. Where were they? What were they doing? With which the Israelis have. So there is an Israeli account of exactly how Yofi and Sharon and Tal, the big three generals, accomplished what they accomplished in Sinai. But we don't have an Egyptian counter-narrative of how the troops performed. And I want to combine that very thick description of the units with a political, geostrategic, diplomatic on the one level, and then much, much higher, the cultural, artistic understanding of the war.
Thank you, Khaled. Well, I would have many side questions, but I don't want to drag us in too many directions. So just before we're switching to the next question, I would just add maybe one or two comments if you want to add something to this, if you want to follow up on this. First, just because you made the assessment. I mean, you made the assessment about the relative absence of Egyptian narrative with regards to the 1967 war. Would you make the same assessment regarding Syria and Jordan, the other main belligerents in the Arab, the other main Arab belligerents in the conflict? And secondly, so we talk about how you bring a new narrative, or at least you make up for the absence of narrative from the Egyptian side. You're talking about the combination of a military and social culture history. Would you have a remark on how would it depart from the existing Western and maybe Israeli scholarship also on the conflict? Maybe that would be
Yeah, these are good questions. As far as the first question, yeah, I think to some degree this is similar to the lack of sophisticated Syrian and Jordanian. I think the Palestinian is much more advanced. The Palestinian account of what happened to the war in the war to Palestinians and the follow-up it's much more developed. There's interesting scholarship on the Palestinian side and the development of the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian revolution, as it is called, from Karame the following year, and also the impact of 67 on the Palestinians is well developed.
Yeah.
It's a sign of the maturity of Palestinian historiography, which is interesting, and it is connected probably to what we are going to say later on. It's precisely because of the lack of a state that the historiographic field is more advanced in Palestine among the Palestinians than it is with a country like Egypt that has a central archives, and Syria, and even Jordan. So it begs the question of what these archives are meant to be doing. But the question about what happened in the Golan, uh, I'm using the Egyptian pronunciation of the um, is actually in Syrian historiography is never developed. The question about the evacuation of the Golan and the timing of it and the complicity of Assad in it is up in the air, but is never really critically developed from 67 onwards. We don't have revisionist accounts there. And the same applies to Jordan. I mean, the scholarship of Avi Shleim on King Hussein and his performance in 67 is the most sophisticated, I think, on the Jordanian side. Now, how do I depart from the Israeli? Well, there are many Israeli narratives about 67. There are two trends, in a sense. There's the trend that is represented by a famous book called The Tanks of Tammuz, which was published only a few months after the war by Shbetai Teveth, who was a biographer of Ben Gurion and a famous historian, and celebrating the gods of war, celebrating these generals and celebrating war, basically. And then you have Amos Oz, and as a young, very, very young writer, just fresh out of the war, and he collects testimonies of the young men from the kibbutzim who had fought in the war, fresh from the front, in a book that he called with Abraham, forgot his last name, The Seventh Day. So it's a picture of the weeping soldier as opposed to the triumphant general. And these two books appeared immediately after the war, few months after the war, published, and became big bestsellers in their own right. And they became the godfathers of two trends of Israeli historiography and historical engagement with the war. One that's, the right wing, if you want, that celebrates the performance of the army and that this was a miracle and so on. And this is the extreme. And then the other one is more critical and bringing in, I mean, it's not in my mind, it's still very, very limited. Now, I'm engaging with it, but I'm not really interested in that. What I want is that, what they say. I mean, for example, even the first trend, they never really identify by name the generals that they were encountering, the generals on the Egyptian front or the Syrian front. Sometimes they mention the units and the unit numbers, but they're not really interested. For them, it's the enemy, which is only to be expected. But what I want is to challenge also their account of a particular battle. Not to say that the Egyptians won. My argument is not that, but is to explain the ease with which they, first of all, to identify the resistance when it did happen in the first day or so, in Rafah, in the first line of defense, as it was called, in Qusayma, and then to explain what happened with the defeat, that in a way that takes into consideration the Egyptian side, not just the agency of the Israeli generals and their cleverness and their maneuverability, and their God-inspired genius, as Teveth is basically saying, but to try and say what were the loopholes in the Egyptian, and there were many, and this is what I'm trying to, in the Egyptian high command, but also in the Egyptian performance on the ground, on so many levels, you know, morale, on equipment, on training, on preparedness, that in my analysis might in turn be a reflection of something much, much deeper that we haven't been paying attention to within the core of the Egyptian state back in Cairo.
Okay. Would you want to add something about the Western literature, or is it too vague, too vast subject to address?
No, the Western literature is Israeli driven.
Okay.
It's Israel that dictates I mean, Western observers. I mean, I don't know the French one, but the British and English literature, and I don't know the Soviet one, to be fair. I don't know. I mean, the Soviet question about the performance and the involvement of the Soviet Union in the war is a big question that I'm very, very interested in, and I'm starting to piece it together again from the point of view of Egyptian understanding of the Soviet and the cleavages and the tensions between different people and across the years from 67 to 73, 74, 72, about what the Soviet Union is up to. So I'm interested in that. But the standard Western English language scholarship is mesmerized by what the Israelis are doing, and they're taking them at their word. They're not being critical of them. So I'm lumping together the English language Western scholarship with the Israeli one.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, from what I've read in French, I kind of had the same feeling that you see the Israeli army, from the point of view of the Israeli army, and the anonymous Arab front, which is overwhelmed by the Israeli side. Yeah, that's
yeah. I mean, there's one side of it is about also weapons. So this war was fought by French planes. So these are Mirage. This is a war about the Mirage against the MiG 15s and 17s and 19s. So so you can imagine what a French historiography will be like with that in mind. The same with the tanks. These are German supplied US tanks fighting Russian tanks. So there is a bias in the literature that is also because this is the height of the Cold War. So this is a dimension also of the scholarship.
Interesting. Thank you. So let's switch to the second question, which will bring us to the big issue of archives. So in his book, Gatekeepers of the Arab Past, Historians and History Writing in 20th Century Egypt, published in 2009, Yoav Dikapwa recounts how Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat established an official committee in 1975 to write the history of the Nasser era, before shifting its mission to collecting the records from this period. And under President Hosni Mubarak, the committee was eventually dissolved. So to paraphrase the late Elias Khoury, who addressed the fate of Arab archives at the Harvard conference in 2017, where are the Egyptian archives of the post-1952 period, and why do they remain inaccessible, at least to a certain extent? Because from what I've read in your article, some Egyptians managed to have limited access, or at least an access to these archives.
No, the archives exist, and they are well preserved. There are military archives and there are civilian archives. So from 52, I mean, as someone who has access to the Egyptian National Archives, which has been founded in 1954, I can tell you that there's very little, very few documents in the Egyptian National Archives pertaining to 67 or 56, or
Okay.
as you're saying, things beyond 52. There are, but not enough. There are documents, there are units pertaining to various ministries, but the so-called sovereign ministries we have in Egypt, we have this phrase, al-Jihat al-Siyadiyya, and now Siyadiyya means intelligence agencies, but traditionally, before Sisi, Siyadiyya are the big four ministries: Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ministry of Justice. These are the four pillars, and these are much more powerful as ministries than, let's say, the Ministry of Education or Ministry of
Mm.
Tourism or Ministry of Health. So what you have in the Egyptian archives are the from after 52 documents of the less important ministries, and not even all the documents.
Okay.
Basically, the Egyptian National Archives acts as a dump for documents that the different government agencies don't know what to do with.
Mm.
There is a law that supposedly a 30-year law that after which time the documents should be delivered in to the Egyptian National Archives.
Mhm.
But that law is never enforced.
Okay.
It's not necessarily because of security agencies or security concerns. It's just inertia, and uh,
Mm.
the law is weak. It doesn't say exactly how the living archives, that is the archives in the originating government agencies, are supposed to keep their archives and how they should deliver them after 5 years or 10 years or 25 years. That mechanism is never crystallized, is never written in law.
Mm.
It's there, but there's no mechanism. So every now and then, a minister comes and discovers that there are these documents, they don't know what to do with them in his or her ministry. And then they say, oh, but we've heard something called the Egyptian National Archives. Why don't we send? So this is why we occasionally hear about these truckloads of documents coming from this or that ministry, taking the documents uh, to be deposited in the Egyptian National Archives. The problem is that the documents in their agency of origin have not been cataloged properly. So when they
Mm.
arrive, the Egyptian National Archives do not have catalogers. They don't have the staff to, so they end up with all of this sudden influx of documents, and they don't know what to do with them. They know that they should keep them, and they know that they should protect them. They know that they
Mhm.
should preserve them. So they do that,
Okay.
but they just keep them, and
Mm.
there's no cataloging and so on. So this is one point. To come back to the four big ministries, they hold on. Their archives are much better organized.
Okay.
Still not as well as one would have hoped for, but I think they are organized. And then we have the intelligence agencies, and then we have the presidency. We know from the memoirs of Nasser's, let's say, chief of staff, Sami Sharaf, who was also his intelligence chief, that he had an extensive archives in uh, across the street from the president's home. Nasser's home is also his office. This is where he conducted his business from.
Mm.
Across the street is Sami Sharaf's office, and Sami Sharaf describes the existence of a very formidable archives that he himself organized. We know from Haeckel that this archive eventually was deposited after Nasser's death to the presidential palace in Abdin.
Okay.
Uh, and very, very often in Haeckel's footnotes, he says there's a copy of what I'm referring to in Abdin, and there's a copy in X. So there's multiple copies. So we know that there is an archive in the president's in the presidency. We know there is an archives obviously in the intelligence services, and we know that there is an extensive archives in the Ministry of War, now called Ministry of Defense. And we, as you pointed out, we have a glimpse of this from some some books few books of people who used to work in the military, retired, became academic historians, one or two. Fatin is one. And in his footnotes, he refers to the Central Archives of the Armed Forces. Excuse me.
No worries.
And from his description of the footnote, in the footnotes, they seem to be very organized. He says folder X, page 215. So it's not one or two documents. There are documents, they have numbers, and they have dates, and there are units. So it seems that there is a very well organized archives. These archives are not meant to be accessible. They are meant to be preserved for the use of, because they've never been released to the National Archives. So they are meant inside the departments of origin, the Ministry of Defense, the Presidency, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Interior. These ministries do not release their documents. And it's very difficult for the Minister of Culture, whose business it is to who has jurisdiction over the National Archives. The National Archives is part of the Ministry of Culture. The Ministry of Culture, the Minister of Culture is much weaker than the Minister of Defense. He cannot go to the Minister of Defense and tell him where are the documents. So that is one problem of why we do not have access. But the problem is deeper than this. You mentioned the committee that Mubarak established. So this, I think, was in 75. That Sadat established, in which Mubarak was president. So this is 75. Let's go backwards, okay? Let's imagine that this is a moment in which the state is saying, we are going to collect documents in order to release them for the public, to tell the story. This was a committee to document the revolution, this 52 revolution. But basically, the main task of this committee is to explain 67. Mubarak started gathering information, and we never really saw the final product. Go back to 54, the moment in which the new revolutionary regime of Nasser decides to pass a law to establish a national archives. That law, which is a foundational law in Egypt, says that the old archives of, it says that we hereby declare the establishment of a national archives of Egypt for the purposes of research and generating historical knowledge and narratives about Egyptian modern history. And the nucleus of this archives will be the royal archives.
Okay.
That had been created by King Fuad in the late 30s. Early 30s, mid 30s. And we are going to add to it other documents, but that's the nucleus of it, and we'll make it accessible to the public. Okay. Go back to that moment of the establishment by King Fuad of the Royal Archives that is described in Yoav Kapwa's book. That was an attempt by King Fuad to generate scholarship and a narrative about his family. And to make the argument that it was the royal palace and the ruling family that brought in modernity to Egypt. The nucleus of that archive was the Daftar Khana that Muhammad Ali had established a century earlier in 1828. So we go back to that moment, and that archive that Dr. Khan means the archives in Turkish, that archives of Muhammad Ali was for his purposes, for the purposes of his bureaucracy that he's building, so that the departments that he's establishing keep their own records, so that when he goes to them and say, I want to find out X, they can dig in their own old papers and find X that he's looking for. Having said that, let me then tell the story from the beginning. Let's start with 1828. In all of these cases, what we have is the state organizing its papers for its own purposes.
Yeah.
These are archives that were never meant to be accessible to the public. It's not meant for research. And this is the case even in France or any, the access question becomes a 20th century question with the move of transparency and accountability, and then the development of freedom of information laws. So, but what is peculiar in Egypt is that because Egypt is a centralized state and a powerful centralized state, it has, and part of its power is its ability to hold documents, organize them, and have access to them, and have its own narrative about what is happening in the country. So this is what Muhammad Ali does. When King Fuad comes, he's competing with other people in the historiographical field. There are popular nationalist historians who are making claims about modernity and state building and denying the central role of the royal family. He says, no, 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 I'm going to establish an institution, that is the archives, the royal archives, to generate a narrative for my purposes. When 54 comes, when the three officers take over, they basically want to challenge that royal narrative, and they want to embarrass the royal family by saying that they were corrupt, they embezzled the money of the Egyptian people, and here, we're going to use their own documents to show them for what they are. And move forward with the committee you are talking about by Sadat. This is Sadat trying to undermine Nasser. So this is a committee, the purpose of which is really to explain, and Sadat has the guts to do this after 73. Now he has the legitimacy, he thinks, to go and challenge the legacy of his predecessor. And so all of this is very similar, and I know that this is a cliche in Egypt, but I'm going to say it anyway. This is similar to the ancient Egyptian pharaonic habit of each pharaoh coming in and erasing the name of his predecessor and wiping it out from the temples. In what is peculiar here is that it's not just erasure. They're not burning all documents. They're not suppressing. They are supposedly establishing an institution, a committee, that would produce an alternative narrative. But the purpose of this alternative narrative is always a state purpose. It's a state logic, and the purpose of which is to challenge an earlier narrative, which again, I understand. The tragedy is that all of this is happening without an input from the people, whether these people are professional historians or the public at large. So the example you mentioned to me earlier about how you as historians in France challenged a certain law that was passed that aimed to restrict access to the archives, we cannot do this in Egypt. We're very, very weak. Constitutionally, we cannot do it. Legally, we cannot do it. Politically, we cannot do it. And we do not have a freedom of information law. We have a clause in the Constitution that says we should have access to information, and that the state protects and supports historic scientific research. But typically, scientific research is meant research in the physical sciences,
Mm.
not the humanities. Um, so, uh, so that is the problem. And then finally, there is because of how these archives have been created and these committees have been created by acts of state, because of the relative weakness of civil society, and because lack of constitutional um, help, uh, we can then explain why the archives end up being controlled by security agencies. So I think as far as the different security agencies are concerned, this has been a mistake from the start. These documents should never have been made accessible to the people. They exist, so they try and restrict. So even given all the problems I described, even this for them is too much. This is too much information made accessible. So yes, there is a National Archives founded in 1954. Yes, the law of this archive says that it is for the purpose of historical research, but no, we are going to control it, and we're going to make it very, very, very difficult for Egyptian citizens to have access to it. So this is where security permits and security clearances come in, the result of which is that the Egyptian National Archives, which has many, many, many hundreds of meters of shelves of documents, have an average number of visitors of less than 10.
Wow, that's so few. Well, thank you. That's fascinating, Khaled, really. And so just to be clear, those documents which are held at the National Archives regarding the post 1952 period remain accessible, even though you have to go through security clearance and
Yes.
okay.
You have to get into the National Archives, you have to get the security clearance.
Yeah.
And even after getting the security clearance, which is very, very difficult to get, and sometimes you have to wait for a year to
Yeah.
get it. Even when you get it, some documents, specifically the documents of the Foreign Ministry, you have to get another permit from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from the Foreign Ministry, to have
Oh,
access to it, even when these documents had already been released by the
yeah.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs and
Yeah.
deposited in National Archives. People in the National Archives say, no, you have to get us a new
Mm.
permit
Yeah, yeah, it's layer after layer
of permits.
process. Well, that's really interesting. Depressing, of course, but that is really interesting. And thank you for this history. And I think that will be really useful to have this insight on the history of archives in Egypt. So this will bring us to the next question on the history without documents, as Omnia Shekri put it, but actually as she's quoting an Egyptian historian who is referring precisely to this period. So while reflecting on this history without documents, historian Omnia Shekri emphasizes the creativity of historians confronted with the obstruction of state archives. So how do you circumvent this obstruction in your research? We already um, grasped a few dimensions of it, but we can get deeper now. And how might it open avenues for new historical inquiries into the 1967 war and its aftermath? And by this, I don't know if the question is clear enough. I mean, because I, I I I draw on my own experience here. I kind of noticed how this obstruction of archives has encouraged new questions to address because of this absence in itself. And one aspect that I'm referring to in particular, and that's the subject of my own article in the special issue, is that why, for instance, and I don't know if it happens also in Egypt, officers kept by their sides some official records, and why do they use them sometimes in their own interviews to prove something, to make a point about something. So that's also tell us about the history of the Lebanese army in this case. But anyway, so that might also have raised the new inquiries. So I'm of course curious about your own thoughts on it. But let's talk first about how you manage this, you faced these challenges.
With difficulty. I am someone who I mean, I've been, as you probably know, I'm a 19th century historian by training, and the training I got is in the archives. I actually did not study history. I studied economics, and I became a historian by, baptism by fire. I was dumped into the Egyptian archives, and I was lucky to have an access to it back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I just found it very rich. And I started reading documents, and I moved from one topic to the other. And I am trained to understand history using primary material. In the 19th century, when I was working with Muhammad Ali, it is his own letters with his own handwriting. I remember my very first day in the Egyptian archives when a folder landed on my desk by mistake, and I started reading it, and I found letters by Napoleon in his handwriting, with his signature landing on my lap. So that's my first day in the Egyptian archives. So that's my understanding of what historical sources are. And to then be confronted by a situation where these documents are non-existent, it's a huge challenge for me, because I don't know what to do. So, but like, let's say, historians of medieval Europe, unlike the historians of early modern and modern Europe, where there is an abundance of documents. They are much more creative, and they are methodologically, conceptually, and in their actual craft of writing, because they have much less documents to play with, and then they have to be imaginative in understanding them and going around the silences. They cannot fill the silences by yet more documents the way you would do with modern documents, with the modern state that generated so much written work. So, and this is what I'm trying to do. So, I'll give you an example. Uh, just an interesting episode. I don't know what form this will take in my forthcoming book, but it's about music, and it's about songs. So famously, on the Israeli side, there is a famous song that is associated with 1967, which is called Jerusalem of Gold, Yerushalayim Vals Zehav. And it's a young songwriter called Naomi Shemer, who Ted Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem, commissioned to write for the ceremony accompanying the Day of Independence, as Israel calls it, on the 15th of May, 1967, before the war. She sang it. Then, lo and behold, a few weeks later, the Israeli army is victorious and enters East Jerusalem, and the Egyptian and the Israeli soldiers find themselves in front of the Wailing Wall. So they burst out singing this same song, but the song is missing, I mean, the song, and of course, it's a Zionist song. It's a song about Jerusalem that is empty, yearning for its people. Now, supposedly, the people have come back. So after the war, she's asked to add a few more stanzas to it, and she does it. And the song becomes very, very popular, to the degree that there were calls to make it the official national anthem of Jerusalem. It has a catchy tune. Many years later, before she dies, basically on her deathbed, she confesses to a journalist that the tune had been borrowed from a Portuguese lullaby. And when you hear both versions, you see the similarity. The Portuguese poet and musician who wrote the original music score didn't sue Naomi Shemer for whatever reasons. So this is an interesting story. I think, it's a story of Zionism. The song is stolen, and it makes wrong allegations of Jerusalem being empty and being liberated. That's the Zionist narrative. Okay, so this is an interesting story. Has nothing to do with archives. It's music, and there's an interesting parallel in Egypt. I'm finding interesting. I mean, maybe this is one way of structuring my thought about how narratives, as you were asking me before, this is an Israeli narrative. How do I counter it? And how do I engage with it? So there's a story of Kulthum, the famous Egyptian singer, who, together with Kamel al-Tawil, the music writer, and Salah Jahin, the very famous lyricist, they write together a song 4 days before the war. And she sings it in Qasr Nil Cinema, the famous platform venue for many of her concerts, on the 1st of May, 1967. And it's called Allah Ma'ak, or راجعين بقوة السلاح. And it's a beautiful song, and it's full of confidence, and we are going to return from usurped Palestine, and after a long, dark night. And there's a video clip, there's a YouTube video clip of her singing that song, with a very peculiar feature. There is a man sitting behind her with a piece of paper whispering in her, because she didn't have time to memorize the lyrics, which is, not Kulthum at all. Kulthum, when she appears, she's in complete control. And this for me is symbolic. So that's, that for me is the moment I want to contrast with Naomi Shemer. Something interesting here about how to analyze this song, and how to take it to be the beginning of the popular understanding, the popular expectation, the exuberance preceding the war, that in a week's time will be in Tel Aviv, and the confidence. And then we know that from biographers and biographies of Kulthum, that she had questions, she had doubts. So she goes to Heikel and she questions him, and Heikel tells her, no. I can't remember, she goes to Heikel or she goes to Amir, the head of the army, and he comforts her and says, no, everything is in order, everything is okay. But she, like many people, had doubts. She, like many people, had enormous feelings. She, like many people, had, it's a complex set of emotions of expectation, exuberance, confidence, but deep, there is doubt. That's what I'm trying to get at. There's questions that people feel. They believe in Nasser. They believe in what he's saying, but they feel something is amiss. Then when the defeat happens, and when Nasser goes on air at 7 p.m. on the 9th of June to admit responsibility and defeat, she collapses like the Egyptian people. And again, according to Karim Gamal in his beautiful biography, big thick book, more than 500 pages, called Kulthum وسنوات المجهود الحربي, Kulthum and the years of raising funds for the army. On that night, she goes to her basement, the basement in her villa, and she shuts herself up. And she stays there for, people say, 2 nights, which is something she used to do before big concerts. She would have this, trying to gather her inner strength. And this time, the account is that she goes there and she's kind of transformed. And she decides to come out and say, okay, I'm an artist. I have nothing but my art. I have nothing but my voice. I'm going to use it to rally public opinion, to raise money for the defeated armed forces, and to give concerts not only in Egypt, but throughout the Arab world, and including, of course, the very famous Paris concert in November of 1967, which is something that she had agreed upon a year before. She had signed a contract to give a performance in October, then it was postponed to November of 67. This is what I'm trying to do. So this is an example of, okay, I don't have documents, but I have these songs and I have these stories. And so my argument, again, to flesh it out and to put my cards on the table, so to speak, here is that this is symbolic of what happened after 67. Nasser and Khartoum, the famous summit of the three no's: no to recognition, no to peace, no to surrender. Um, uh, but also the Egyptian people basically saying no. No to what? Yeah, we've been defeated, but we will not sign on the dotted line. And that's part of the story of the 67 war that I want to talk about. I'm not starting with it, by the way. You know, as I told you, I want to start with the actual details of combat. But I want to be able to add layers upon layers to go to a moment like this of Kulthum and also the Egyptian people, because that's a transformative night, the night of the 9th to the 10th of June. And this is a this is one of the most complex moments in modern Egyptian history of people feeling shocked, defeated, but somehow they still find it in themselves to say yes to Nasser. He comes and says, I'm responsible, I resign. They say no. And this is a very complex, of course, it can be easily dismissed as, of course, this is what tyrants do, this is what despots do. They make people feel orphaned if they disappear. And that's partly true. But Nasser is much more complex than that. And this moment is much more complex than this facile nation. This moment of defeat is much more, because this moment of defeat is also a moment of determination and hope. And it's a moment in which Egypt leadership and society says, we reject the results of the defeat. We will not bring Nasser down and bring another person who would be ready to go to Washington to sign on the dotted line. We refuse that. No one said it in so many words, but that is what I take. This is how I understand and interpret the demonstrations that took to the streets on the 10th of June. And this is how I explain this transformative moment in Kulthum's mind. And she transforms herself from a crushed, defeated human being to a determined artist who's going to use her art to elevate the spirits and to live to fight another day.
Thank you, Khaled. That's fascinating as well. Just to cover maybe a wider range of sources that you use as well. And I know you already mentioned it, but so you also make a great use of memoirs, as you put it. I was also wondering whether you tried, and if not, maybe you can explain why whether you tried to conduct oral history interviews with some people from the highest echelons from to the lowest echelons of the army, and if that is still possible today, and if it's worth considering today.
You know, it's a good question. I haven't done it, and maybe it's a mistake. I tried once or twice through Zoom. I'm not trained as an oral historian, but that's not a good excuse. Um, uh, there are 2 points I can add. One is that I'm living in Boston and I have difficulty going back to Egypt.
Okay.
I have a, a motion detector here in the office, so when there's no motion, the lights go off, so I have to bring it on every now and then. And secondly, as I tried to say at the beginning, I really feel that the memoirs, the published memoirs, offer fascinating information that people haven't used
Yeah.
enough of. So I'm actually finding material. I'm
Yeah.
finding enough material. I just had to let go of thinking that sources need to be archival primary
Yeah.
sources. And now I'm finding enough material to, of course, I have questions. Um, I still have questions uh, that I think can only be answered by primary sources. So yes, interviews would have helped to answer some of these questions. And I haven't done it partly because I'm not in Egypt and it's difficult to conduct
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Of course.
interviews by Zoom with people
Yeah.
I don't know. Um,
I completely agree.
and people will be very you know, because interviewing something like this, people feel uh, it, after more than 50 years after the war, people still think that feel uncomfortable talking about it
Mhm.
because of the present regime. We are ruled by a military dictatorship. So people
Yeah.
fear that speaking about 67 may somehow be taken to be a subversive
Mhm.
message about the army now, which, you know, it's a valid concern given what is happening currently in Egypt. People are scared. And I don't think Zoom can help.
Yeah.
It's not a for them, they don't feel it's not a suitable medium to conduct interviews.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I remember when it was COVID time and because of the pandemic, I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to conduct any interview in Lebanon, and I tried a couple of times through WhatsApp to conduct interviews. It didn't work out. People were really, really mistrustful of my intentions. Yeah, so yeah, nothing replaces direct interviews. Um, but yeah, this also brings me to another source that we haven't mentioned, and I know you make also a great use of it. It's the Egyptian press at the
Mm.
time. So can you maybe tell us a little about how you make use of the press and how free was the press at the time? How was it allowed to? How much was it allowed to speak freely about the defeat at the time?
No, yeah, we have access here in Boston because of the Harvard Library, the Library of Harvard University, of a whole run of Egyptian weeklies. And we also have access to the Daily Ahram. I don't have access to Al Jumhuriya, which is also a very useful source, but that's a daily newspaper that we don't have. But it's available,
Okay.
digitized. So maybe we can ask for it too. But what I do is let's say I have, you know, I come across an event either before, during, or after the war, and I know that this is something that has happened. So I try and just go to Al-Ahram. First thing I do, go to Al-Ahram and just see how it was covered. Um, and just having access to Al-Ahram and going through and reading, you know, things around it, the op-eds and the commentaries and the different other articles, and see what people were reading. So I'm not reading Al-Ahram to be, you know, this is we've been trained subconsciously over the years. When we read Egyptian papers, we don't read it to get information. We read between the lines. We don't read the lines. We read what are they trying to say? What
Mm.
are they not saying. And this has become second nature to us. So we know not to trust. I mean, but it's not a question of trust. I mean, this is what we have. We can still read it. It's not we read it because this is true. We read it because we know it's not true. Everybody knows it's not true, but it still says something.
Okay.
So I try and imagine how people read what they read back then. I also try and see, especially Haeckel's op-eds every Friday. Haeckel has amazing articles. Every Friday he has this long, page-long, whole page called Basaraha, which people back then, as now, they read it not as an op-ed of a newspaper. They read it to see what Nasser thought, because this is what Nasser thought. So these are interesting. And sometimes, as I said, Haeckel's articles, these are policy pieces. So they're very important to read, to see how he understood the closure of the Strait of Tehran. And then you analyze it, you read it critically, and you read how people engaged with it. But newspaper can tell you something that they don't intend to tell. So I'll give you an example. In late March, early April of 67, unrelated to the war, the Ahram started covering news, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what this was. They started writing about a rumor spreading in society about blood, about a gang that is trading in blood. And it's one day after the other, one day after another, and every day the coverage is longer and the plot thickens, and I don't know what this. And then I started reading in secondary literature, the so-called gray literature. Not serious books, but pamphlets that again are amazingly preserved in the Harvard Library, of Isha'at al-Dam, the blood rumor, the rumor of blood. It turns out this was a national event. It's associated with two things. It's associated with a campaign to donate blood, unrelated to the war. It's a national campaign that happens each year. And associated with a gang that supposedly is using this campaign to make money out of donated blood. But then there is panic. Something goes wrong. And Al-Ahram doesn't really say what the panic is about. It says there is a rumor spreading. It never says what the rumor is. But it says that the rumor is causing panic. And the panic is causing mothers to go to the schools where the campaign for donation takes place, to snatch their kids from schools because they're afraid of something. Then sometimes and this is associated with a cholera inoculation campaign. So there is something about blood being drawn and something about vaccines being injected. And all of this is happening at the same time. And it's covered by Al-Ahram. It has nothing to do with the army. It has nothing to do with the war. The war had not broken out. But then I discover surreptitiously, finally, I discover what the rumor is. The rumor that people say is that the campaign is not a campaign to donate blood. This is a campaign, this is the rumor, to withdraw blood from our kids and send the blood to the army in Yemen.
That's telling.
So what does this, as a historian, what does this tell me? This is covered day after day, and there is a big campaign, and then it culminates in the middle of April with 2 long pages on 2 successive days with a map. And I'm reading this when I discovered this in the middle of COVID, when it was so similar, like the spread of the disease of the epidemic in COVID times,
Mm.
the spread of the rumor. So there's a map that Al Ahram designs of where the rumor started. It started in Ismailia, and then it spread, and then it entered into Cairo. And then the Egyptian authorities and the Arab Socialist Union are ready to combat the rumor. What is the rumor? What's the meaning of the rumor? The meaning of the rumor is literally the army is sucking us dry. The army in Yemen
Yeah.
is corrupt. And these officers, as we know, this is the meaning of the War of Yemen, the Egyptian meaning, the Egyptian popular meaning. There
Mm.
is the Hakel meaning, which is that Nasser is fighting um,
Yeah.
capitalism and colonialism and imperialism, which is true. But there's another war taking place in Yemen, and that is a war whereby Egyptian officers are making money by trading in counterfeit and commodities from Aden, transporting them on
Mm.
Egyptian aircraft, military aircraft, and selling them in the Egyptian black market. This is known. We know this. This is the meaning of Yemen. But then it explodes in this fashion of a rumor called the blood rumor, and this is the meaning of it. So this is what I'm trying to say when I was in response to the earlier question. When I say people suspected something, they felt something, they smelled something, they know something is wrong. And this is one of the things I'm trying to get at through newspapers. So newspapers can say something about Nasser, can say something about Hakel. That's not how I read them.
Yeah.
I read them because they give me a feel for the period. The ads, the jokes, the cartoons, uh, the articles unrelated to the war, the coverage of artistic events, plays, and what is it that people read? What is it that people talked about? And in few cases like this spectacular one, what is it that people are rumoring about? What are the
Mm.
rumors that people exchange, and how can we listen to them and make sense of them?
Thanks. That's fascinating. This way of accessing somehow the how do we say the mentalities or the consciousness of the people at the time. This
Mm.
reminds me of the work, just as a side note, of recent work by Robert Downton, the Harvard historian who wrote like the Revolutionary Temper on the
Yes.
French Revolution, and how he draws from the
And Arlette Farg's
Arlette Farge, exactly, yeah. Yeah,
Subversive Words. I think that's the
exactly.
title in English of her book.
Yeah, exactly. And he talks about Arlette Farge also, Robert Downton in his own book, because he draws also on the police archives in Paris.
Mm.
Well, that's
Mm.
fascinating. Thank you. Um, so let's switch maybe to the second part of the interview, which will be more about this time the state and society, and the way maybe the Egyptian state recovered somehow from the crushing defeat. So the following question draws on what you wrote in a 2017 article published in Bidayat, in which you describe the outcome of the 1967 war as not only a military defeat, but also the defeat of a political, social, and intellectual system. So, as we already mentioned, your research extend beyond the military history of the conflicts, addressing both the Egyptian state and society. We already address a little the workings of the Egyptian state with regards to archives, but we can maybe also reflect on how the 1967 war offer insight into the workings of the Egyptian state and its power, but also the state-society relations in Egypt.
That's a good question. When I gave that interview or wrote that article back in Bidayat in 2017, I had in mind this book by Shivelbush called The Culture of Defeat. I mean, he's not a professional historian, but he has incisive ideas about these big defeats, the defeat of the American South in the Civil War, the defeat of France and its war with Germany in 1870, the defeat of Germany in the First World War. These big defeats that are not just military defeats, they're, social and cultural defeats. And he says that these are, because of the scale of the defeat, they are usually followed not simply by a treaty that translates the military victories or defeats into new diplomatic realities, but they are deeper than this. They're followed by a revolution, by a coup, by a palace coup, something that big. And of course, a big, big social transformation in ideas and values. And so, and I was thinking, well, 67 is one such defeat. It's big. So we need to explain it not only on the level of the military, but what else is taking place. So, so I started, the light went off. So conceptually, I'm using the amazing breakthrough in terms of analysis that Hazem Qandil had published in his book, Soldier, Statesmen, Spies and Statesmen, which is an amazing tripartite division of Egyptian state, not between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative, but between the presidency, the army, and the intelligence services. He said, this is how you understand Egyptian politics. Try and separate these are agencies that are not working in unison with each other. They're competing. And he takes that story from 52 to 2011. And his chapter on 67 is fascinating, and also about 73 and under Mubarak. So the presidency is fighting with the army, and both have competing intelligence services that they use in the internecine war with each other. And that was a breakthrough for me. And you start reading 1967 along these lines. So this is basically my punchline. 67 in my account. Yeah, it has big geostrategic Haykali reasons as referring to Haykal. I'm in Arabic, there's a double entendre here because Haykal means a structure. So
yeah.
A Haykali explanation is a structural explanation, but it also pertains to Haykal as a person and as Nasser's national security. So there is the Haykal explanation of a grand forces of imperialism and oil money and petrodollars and intelligence people in Washington and Moscow and Tel Aviv, going beyond the governments of, like deep states. That's true. But Egypt also had its own deep state that he avoids to talk about. So Egypt is not Nasser. And there is a structural tension between the presidency and the army, whereby Nasser is competing with Amir. And Abdul Hakim Amir is the commander-in-chief. He's actually deputy commander-in-chief. Nasser is the commander-in-chief, but basically he had ceased to be able to control his army from 62 onwards. Definitely by 64, Nasser cannot appoint or dismiss the generals, which means that he's not in control of his army. Once you realize this, then you are forced to understand 67 in a different way. So it now seems that the measures that we associate with Nasser, that this thing called Egypt took in May of 1967, that led to the escalation, that led to the war on the 5th of June, were actually not taken by Nasser, were taken by Amir. The decision to mobilize the troops and send them to Sinai on the 15th of May, the decision to expel the United Nations peacekeeping troops on the 18th of May, the decision finally to close the Straits of Tiran to Israeli navigation, which is something that Israel had always said it would recognize as an act of war, a casus belli, on the 22nd of May. These steps seems not to have been taken by Nasser, but by Amir. And it's Nasser who trying to put the brakes on this. So this is one explanation of, an answer to your question, how can we understand 67 as a way to understand the internal structure of the state? This tension becomes, or this question becomes even much more pertinent after the war, because we forget, we Egyptians, we analysts, that there is a coup against Nasser. It's a failed coup, but it's a coup attempt in the summer months following the defeat. So the defeated generals, they gather around Amir. They literally gather around Amir in his home. And Amir's home on the Corniche of Cairo in Giza becomes a bastion of resistance to Nasser, and they are hatching a plot to get rid of him. And we have the newspaper coverage when the plot is hatched. They are arrested, they're put on trial, and the Ahram covers the trial in 1968, day after day, in March of 1968. We now know how serious this plot was.
Okay.
To what degree we can believe Al-Ahram, of course, to what degree this was a transparent trial, it's only obviously up to question. But from the published memoirs, there's overwhelming corroborating evidence that there was a plot to get rid of Nasser, that Nasser's intelligence men, the third part of this triangle, got wind of it. And the question is, who's going to strike first? And Nasser struck first one day before the coup was supposed to take place. And he managed with his men to arrest Amir and his men and to put him on trial. Eventually, Amir committed suicide on the 12th or 11th of September. And the question is, did he commit suicide or did they kill him? Or as people say, was he suicided? So there is that, there's this tension in the Egyptian state that it kind of disintegrates, but it is repackaged and reformulated because of something else that Qandil does not mention. So for me, it's not a triangle. For me, it's a square. And the fourth corner of the square is the people. The famous proverbial street. Not the Arab Socialist Union, not the party, but the people, because the party is ineffective and not really that important. But the people, Kulthum, that transformation, the citizens who take to the streets in a very raw form, very, very exposed, very unorganized, very atomized, but they mobilize not because people tell them, but because of this link they have with Nasser, which is very, very complex to analyze. There's some magical link. I know I'm not a Nasserite, and I'm basically, my argument is to blame Nasser for the defeat. But that's a facile statement to say, because Nasser is much more complex than being, dumped as a dictator. There's some very, very deep connection that he had with the people because of the values that he espoused.
Yeah.
People take to the streets and they manage to basically give him a new mandate to A, get rid of Amir and his men, and B, reconstitute the armed forces and fight Israel. And people say and do this knowing that their kids will not get out of the army, their economy is in tatters, and they will pay the brunt of it. They will carry this heavy burden, but and there's 1 million Egyptian citizens who evacuated from the Suez Canal cities. And it's a bleak, bleak, bleak moment. But there is a silver lining in it, and that silver lining is the rejection of the defeat. So this is my long answer to the question of how I can offer something similar to what Chivelbush is saying. The repercussion of a defeat that big. My initial answer was, where is the coup? And I found there is a coup. We forgot it in our literature and in our collective memory. We concentrated on the joke about Amir, whether or not he was killed or suicided or committed suicide. But that's a smoke screen that we have to cover the trauma of something bigger. So there is the coup, not the suicide. That's the main story. And then deeper than this, there is the Egyptian rejection, the Egyptian people's rejection of the defeat, and the new mandate they give to Nasser to live to fight another day.
Thank you, Khalid. That's also really fascinating. I hope you're not too much in a hurry. It's fine so far, or we're a bit
Yes.
late? Do we run a
Yeah.
bit late?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So let's switch to the next question then. So despite suffering a crushing military defeat in 1967, Egypt rapidly managed to launch a war of attrition against Israel. And 6 years later, the Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal and destroyed the Bar-Lev line, which marked the outbreak of the October War in 1973. So to go back to what we were saying earlier, how do you reconcile this vision of a systemic defeat in 1967 with the swift recovery of the Egyptian armed forces in the aftermath of the war? And did this contradiction lead you to extend your research to the War of Attrition and the October 1973 war? If I understood correctly, that's also part of your research project now.
It is, but there's something that you don't know, which is I'm also going backwards. So for the past few months, I've been working on the 1958 to 1965
Okay.
project by Egypt to build missiles, long-term missiles, the famous Zafir and Qahir missiles that were paraded in Egypt 1962. So I've been working on that project. So I'm expanding my
Yeah.
research project on both directions.
Okay.
Now I realize that 67, is complex. You cannot start it on the 15th of May or the 5th of June. It starts earlier, and it doesn't stop on the 9th of June when Nasser announces his resignation. It's a long war. And one of the questions that I'm asking, it's a slightly different way of posing your question, which is, this defeat, it's a defeat, but Egypt did not sign the capitulation treaty in 67 or 68. We signed our capitulation. We surrendered in 79. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, the Egyptian surrender, this is how I see it, happened in 79. And it happened after 73, obviously. It happened after the October War. So the question for me is, how can we explain this? What happened in this 10-year period? So this is a long-term project, but for me, the current question is this war of attrition. It's between 67 and actually 70. And to explain how the Egypt managed to make this transition. And again, the key is what I said earlier regarding the internal, so there is a way of explaining it by saying Nasser immediately, the traditional explanation. Even before the end of June, Egypt receives a high-level delegation by the Soviets, including the premier of the Soviet Union and the chief of staff of the Egyptian army, who stays in Egypt for 3 months to supply Egypt with a new army, a new training. And then
Yeah.
bit by bit, Egyptian armed forces is rebuilt, and then they sink the Israeli destroyer Eilat off the shores of Port Said in October, and that's the supposed beginning of the War of Attrition. And this War of Attrition takes place across the Suez Canal, whereby Egyptian artillery, which is more superior than the Israeli artillery, is bombing the Israelis across the canal, basically telling them, we're going to deny you the wreaths of your laurels. You're not going to allow you to sit and enjoy the benefits of the defeat. We're making life difficult and costly. The occupation will make it costly for you. Israel retaliates a couple of years later by deploying its air force, and its air force goes to bomb Egyptian cities, Egyptian installations, all the way down to Naga Hammadi in the south, few 100 kilometers north of Aswan, for people who don't know what Naga Hammadi is. Way, way in the south, they bombed Cairo and the famous massacre of Bahr al-Bar, a school, primary school, that is bombed and school kids are killed, 1969. All of this, and then eventually Egypt manages to get Air Force anti-aircraft batteries, missile batteries, and they crawl these batteries, as the word was used, mile by mile, mile by mile, all the way to August of 1970, when they are now at the edge of the canal, which means what? It means that the Egyptian army has an umbrella of air defense, which meant that Israel is no longer capable, the Israeli Air Force is no longer capable of penetrating to the deep and bombing Egyptian vital centers. And that is what allowed the Egyptians to cross the canal. It's not because the Egyptian Air Force has been rebuilt. It's because the Egyptian air defense is capable of offering a sheltering umbrella that prevents the Israeli aircraft from attacking the units. So the crossing is spectacularly successful. The Egyptian planners had estimated that they would lose, I think, 20,000 men in the first day. They lost less than 100. I mean, or double digits, not triple digits. They lost, I can't remember the exact number, but very, very few men. It was meticulously planned and flawlessly executed. Spectacular success. And then we have a big question of what happened later on. You know, that's another war and another question. But again, Hazem Qandil's conceptual framework applies. There is a tension continuing between the Egyptian presidency and the Egyptian army. Sadat's intentions of the war are kept hidden from his generals. And he's playing one general after another because he wants a diplomatic resolution to the conflict, which he manages to do by opening a secret channel of communication via his national security advisor with the American national security advisor, who's Kissinger, in the middle of war. Actually, on the 10th or 8th of October, 2 days into the war, Sadat tells the Americans, basically the Israelis, that we have no intention to deepen the conflict. This is the word that is used. And basically, I'm ready for negotiation. Tell me what you want. And that's the beginning of a series of capitulations that led to Camp David and the signing of the peace treaty the following year in 1979. But because I also, it's not a triangle, it's a square, I also include the Egyptian people. So where are the Egyptian people, and how can we explain the 180-degree shift in public opinion from rejecting the defeat in 1967, in June 1967, to asking for capitulation, or at least to be ready um, to accept what Sadat has said. And this is a huge social transformation, a social revolution, right-wing social revolution, that the best analyst of it is Ghali Shokri in his book Counter-Revolution in Egypt, الثورة المضادة في مصر, that he published in, I think, 1979, to explain the economic, social, and cultural. This is Egypt's best cultural critic, by the way, in my mind. He has published amazing books on theater and literature in the 60s. But then this is his magnum opus. This is his analysis not only of culture, but of the economy that made possible the peace treaty with Israel in 1979.
That's fascinating. I would have so many questions, but I know we have to to wrap up soon. So I'll just follow the questionnaire that I prepared. But yeah, I'm definitely curious about reading his work. Then I haven't heard about this work. Um, so yeah, just to go back maybe to your first research, because we were talking about how you were a historian drawing on archives and the Egyptian National Archives in particular. And in your first work, then you focused on the soldiers' daily experiences in Mehmet Ali's army and their resistance to conscription as a way to challenge the nationalist portrayal of this Ottoman governor as the founder of modern Egypt. So, um, despite the fact that you don't draw on this, you cannot draw on the same type of archives. Have you tried to adopt a bottom-up approach to write a revisionist history of the 1967 war? And well, I guess we addressed a little this aspect already. How might this social and cultural history challenge existing narratives of the conflict? If you don't want to go deeper on this because we kind of addressed this before, it will be okay, of course. But
Well,
maybe
I'll
just
say one or two words. Yeah, we addressed a lot of it before already, but there are two fascinating memoirs written by soldiers. Actually, one is written by an officer, but not a general, not a
okay,
commander.
yeah,
His name is Yunus, Muhammad something Yunus. Is a very famous book called خطوات على الأرض المحبوسة. And the other one is Higazi, الأسرى يقيمون المتاريس. Both were captured. And the memoirs of both of them are memoirs of captivity. So it's their account of what happened to them in Israeli captivity. They were released a year later, and they're fascinating because, but I mean, this is about captivity, but there is few pages in each of them about their combat experience before captivity, which is basically a day and a half, as I said, of war, of combat. War happened early on the 9th of June, of the 5th of June. They're captured on the 6th. They don't know each other. They end up captured in different places in Sinai. So they are fascinating accounts because they tell us a lot. They are good writers and they have fascinating insights, and it's a bottom up. So it's not the Haeckel perspective. It's a completely different perspective, and it shows the tensions that I'm looking for, that I have detected. So it's how the tensions between Nasser and Amir, between the presidency and the military, can be felt
mm,
on the level of the fighting unit. And people don't know, but they experience. You can see the impact of this tension on the ground. And it's up to the reader, finally, when I write up my analysis, to see to what degree this analysis is convincing. But to go back to the earlier, so I don't want to repeat myself, but the other aspect of doing a bottom up is to do the cultural history of the war
yeah.
outside Sinai, in society at large. How did people understand the war? And yeah. So this we talked about.
Yeah, thank you. Um, and so yeah, so this last question, which will bring us more about the present, maybe than the history of the conflict itself. So over the past few years, and that's also how I kind of had access to your research so far. You've been using social media platforms to share insights from your research on what you termed structural and enduring defeat. Um, we kind of also addressed some issues, but I think it would be interesting to dig deeper into the history of the 1967 war with regards to the present state of Egypt and maybe the Arab world. So what does this history tell us about the present state of Egypt? Maybe the narrative itself has evolved, even though you were saying that the narrative is somehow still absent. And how has the historiography of this conflict evolved in Egypt as well over the past 50 years? So maybe just to sum up what you said earlier, and I will try to maybe take some aspects that you mentioned earlier in this question, in this answer to this question.
Two things. I've been using social media mostly to, like what I'm doing with you now, to try and articulate my thoughts. So I'm doing something that I haven't done before, and few academic historians do, which is to make use of social media to, in a sense, bounce off my ideas. So I'm actually exposing myself. I'm saying to people, look, I really don't have like, I haven't written the work. I don't know what my conclusions are. So I'm thinking aloud. And it's been very, very useful, partly because our conversation today, you don't know, but there are a couple of ideas that had never come to my mind before.
I'm happy to hear this then.
So it's useful for me,
Okay.
just bouncing off ideas, like going to conferences and sharing ideas is useful. But you're sharing ideas with social media. I'm not talking about you, but in social media with non-academics, and the reactions is very useful, very productive. So 5 years ago, as a result of these talks, once I received a contact, I mean, an email from a messenger on Facebook, a message on Messenger on Facebook by someone. I won't say who, but who had an invaluable source that I don't talk about, and I won't, but it's an invaluable source. It's a memoir of a general.
An
It's
unpublished memoir, I guess.
unpublished memoir written in his own handwriting. People don't know about it and has unique information. And eventually he sent me a PDF of it and eventually sent it to me. So I have it with me. It's the most precious thing that I own. So social media can be useful in different ways. It can be useful for sources of information, anecdotes, people, and other people have sent me. There's this other story of I was doing interviews with two colleagues I've never met, again, social media, and one of them said, "Do you know X?" I said, "Well, yeah, actually, I know the name. One of the generals who was captured in '67, and every now and then I go to the internet and I look for information because there's so much being released and digitized and made accessible. So there is this company, Belgian company, I'm sure you know it, Pathé. So I found an interview with this general in English being captured, and he's an interview in captivity. And it turns out that this guy who's making the interview with me is his grandson. And I said, "Well, you don't know. Don't you know that your grandfather is captured on this video?" So I sent it to him. He sent it to his mother, who's this general's daughter. And she, in reciprocity, sent me the letters that her father had sent to her mother
Wow.
in captivity.
Oh
So
my God. That's
So things
amazing.
like this, you know, like
Yeah.
these letters and these, they're just, so social media can be very productive and can be useful. For me, it has been useful in airing out ideas, getting feedback from people, suggestions of things to read. This connection about the blood rumor, I knew about it, but I didn't know the secondary literature. So someone wrote to me and said, "Do you mean the story that is written about by Kishk?" And Kishk has a, you know, Kishk is someone who I would not have read. He's not a serious historian, but he he's commenting on what is happening in society, and he mentions it. It's a book that he published in 73. Um, so this is one point. The second is the present. So this is a difficult moment because 67 is being resurrected now in light of what's happening in Gaza. And
Mhm.
and um, I have to admit that I have not been active on social media. Uh, this war is too heavy, too painful for me to engage. I've been really overwhelmed by it. It's very, very, very painful. But personally, I'm making these connections between 67, trying to understand how my knowledge about 67 can help me understand the current moment. I don't think I have good insights about it. I think when I was working on the War of Attrition, the War of Attrition project started really literally with the beginning of the war on Gaza in October of last year. And it was about how a society like Egyptian society in defeat resists to assert its right to exist. And okay, so that's one kind of insight. But of course, the current war is complex. And there is a way of understanding the Israeli perspective of it, and they are making the connections with 67. They think it is a 67 moment. It's a moment in which they can redraw the map strategically, the strategic map of the region the way they did in 67. But then I remind myself of what I just told you. 67, they inflicted a heavy defeat, but they didn't reap the result. The strategic map of the Middle East was not redrawn in 67, was redrawn in 79. So the question is what happened in Egypt between 67 and 79 that can be useful to understand what is happening and make a connection with what's happening now. And that is something that as you could hear me earlier, I'm still struggling to find. I think I know that period up to 73, 74, but what the collapse, the defeat of Egypt happened in 79. The defeat, the capitulation happened in 79. How did this happen? And as someone who participated in 2011, I think we were trying to reassert the fourth corner of the triangle. We were trying to, so I think the way I understand it is domestically in Egypt, it's a struggle constantly between those who want to think of politics as limited in the triangle and who's like us who want to transform the triangle into a square and bring in the people to as a player in analytically and politically. And I'm still struggling to understand why, you know, this is the moment that I live now, how it is that we've been cast out and defeated by our regimes. So I know I'm not being very coherent now, which is a sign of the struggle I'm facing. But I think if I were trying to sum it up, I think the connection between the 67 and the current moment has to pass by 79 and has to pass by 2011. 79 was when Egyptian society gave in because Sadat had popularity in what he did. And 2011, it was not an accident that one of the first targets of demonstrations in 2011 was the Israeli embassy. It's not that people were saying, let's go to war with Israel, but that the terms of the surrender need to be revised. And I think what is happening in Egypt now is an attempt to say we cannot allow the war to continue with the complicity of Sisi and his regime and other regimes in the region the way they have been over the past year. And how can we re-enter into the political arena to stop this from happening, to put an end, to put a stop to this. So as I always, you know, I mean, this is an old story, an old question, whether the road to Jerusalem passes through Cairo or the road to Cairo passes through Jerusalem. They are intricately connected. What happens in Palestine is intricately connected to what happens in Amman, in Damascus. Palestine is so central. And the current war, you know, Israel might be waging it to think that they were triumphant and they are signing the Abraham Accords and the Camp David Accords and the Wadi Araba Accords with Jordan, and things are over. But we are bringing the square instead of the triangle to say, no, you are missing out. You're signing these treaties with the rulers who are complicit, who are basically traitors. And any analysis of 67 that takes into consideration this, you know, this conflict. You start from the military, but you don't stop there. You expand and you enlarge the analysis to include the people, ultimately, culture, history, society, forces, the economy, to explain this big transformation. And that's what I'm struggling to do. And it's very difficult given the current war.
Thank you, Khaled. Well, note a final note on the people, I think that leave us with a kind of also optimistic thinking, despite the terrible situation that we are living now. So I think that's important. And yeah, I think well, from my modest point of view, I completely agree with you. And at some point, both Israel's and the political regimes in the Arab states won't be able to discard the people on the longer run. That's our hope, all of us. So well, thank you so much, really, for this interview. It was so rich. I will listen to it with much pleasure to digest it progressively.
Thank you, Jonathan. These are very good questions. Thank you so much for sending them and for sharing them with me and for giving me this opportunity, because for me, it is an opportunity to chat and bounce off ideas. So